Okay, we are on Chavav Amud Beis 26b, toward the bottom of the page. We came to the conclusion yesterday of the discussion that we began a couple of days back, which is understanding the Mishnah, which said that considering that the verse says that the husband warned his wife about secluding herself in intimacy with an ish, so the Mishnah said this excludes someone who's not an ish. We wanted to understand who exactly is this non-ish about which the husband might warn, and that warning has no halachic consequence. Right? The Torah says that he warns her about an ish. So if he warned her about a non-ish, it would be of no consequence. So what exactly is this non-ish? So we went through a few different options. Maybe the non-ish is a person who is sick and therefore incapable of complete sexual activity. But we concluded, no, that person's also an ish. And therefore, if a husband warned his wife about secluding herself with a person of that kind of sickness, that kind of illness, the warning is still valid. Then we suggested maybe it's a non-Jew. That non-Jew doesn't qualify as, quote, ish. But the Gemara concluded, no, a non-Jew is an ish. And therefore, if a husband warned his wife against secluding herself with a non-Jew, that warning is valid. And if she violated the warning, she'd become a Sotah and all the rest of it. So finally, the Gemara concluded yesterday that the non-ish is an animal. If he warns his wife about secluding herself with a certain animal, then that warning is of no halachic consequence. And if she secludes herself with that animal, there's no Sotah proceeding, because the warning is of no consequence. Because the warning must be issued about an ish, and an animal doesn't qualify as ish. Ish meaning a man. I'm explaining it doesn't mean a man in the English term, but the halachic designation of what an ish is. I'm explaining what's the reason. Because the ain's nus behema, a woman who engages in bestiality doesn't get the halachic designation of a zayna. A zayna is loosely translated as a harlot, but it's not the right translation. Again, we use English terms to describe things, but in the original biblical text, we have to think of them in what is the halachic definition. What's the legal rubric? So a woman who engages in a zayna activity is to divorce her husband, right? Or through that activity, maybe loses her kohanic privileges if she's a daughter of a kohen. And the question is, does bestiality constitute as a zayna activity? It's certainly very immoral, and maybe they should go to divorce considering her behavior. And maybe like I said yesterday, she should probably go to therapy to deal with that, considering the baseness of that morality. But nonetheless, it doesn't qualify as, quote, a zayna. It doesn't constitute the halachic definition of what a zayna is. Therefore, because there's no zayna activity with the woman, with an animal, bestiality doesn't constitute as zayna. Therefore, a warning that the husband issues to his wife about secluding herself with an animal is of no consequence and has no halachic value. This is where we left off yesterday. Now the Gemara is going to cite the textual proof for this notion. Okay, this is where we are. Clear? Clear? Okay. I'm not sure if you've been following the classes till now, but a lot of it's built on what we said before, but I hope to bring this up to speed a little bit so we can follow.
No, the one class I took a week with you, it's like I didn't miss anything.
Oh, thank you.
It's like because you always.
I always try to recap to bring us to where we are.
Recap, and that's just enough to keep me up to date.
Okay, good. I'm happy to hear that.
That's what.
Although I still encourage you to listen to the other classes anyway.
I know.
Get a better understanding, but nonetheless, I'm happy to hear that. Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to get to scriptural proof for this notion that engaging in bestiality, as immoral and as forbidden as it is, doesn't constitute being a zona. So Amalei Rava Prazika, I think I'm pronouncing it correctly. Rava Prazika said, "Le Rav Ashi to Rav Ashi, Minaha Milsa." From where do we derive this item? The Amar Rabbanan that our sages said, which we just quoted earlier, Ains nus behema. Bestiality does not equal being a zona, as wrong as it is. So where did our sages derive that? So explained Rava to his friend, to his colleague Rav Ashi. As the verse reads, I'm going to reload the page and see if we can get this text clearer. No, that's better. As the verse reads, Loisavi esnan zaina umechir kelev. This verse is a unique law with regard to what kind of animals may or may not be offered on the altar. And the verse reads that an animal, kosher animal, used as payment for a zina, for a harlot, a prostitute, someone paid a prostitute using a sheep, then that sheep cannot be offered in the temple. You know, it's a kosher animal. Because it was used to barter prostitution, then animal is forbidden. Likewise, mechir kelev. If someone bartered a sheep for a dog, so he bought a dog using a sheep or some other kosher animal, which otherwise would be allowed to be offered in the temple.
The other way, you mean?
He bartered a sheep for a dog.
No, but you said it the other way. He
gave
a dog for the sheep.
That's right. He gave a dog for a sheep. Now he has a sheep. That sheep cannot be used in the altar. This is what Torah says. It's esnan zoina, an animal bartered for prostitution, mechir kelev, and an animal used as payment for a dog. These two animals cannot be brought in the altar. That's what the Torah says. Now, says Rava to Rav Ashi, Tanya, we learned in a Mishnaic age text based on this verse. What if it's the reverse around? Esnan kelev, a person used an animal to pay for bestiality, to pay for sexual activity with a dog. So reverse it. Used before where the person purchased the dog and he paid for prostitution with a woman using an animal. What if the other way around? I pay for prostitution of an animal, and then I use a sheep to purchase a woman, a maidservant. What if it's the reverse? Following? With a dog, in the text, with the dog, I purchased the actual body of the dog. And with the prostitution, I didn't own the woman, I just paid for the prostitution, paid for the activity. Right? What if it's the reverse? I paid for the activity of the dog, and I paid for the purchase of a woman, for the purchase of a prostitute. The reverse. Yeah, following? So what if it's esnan kelev? The person paid for bestiality to engage sexually with a dog, and he paid for that privilege for that insanity, using a sheep. Or mechir zayna, he bought an actual prostitution, not paid for the activity of prostitution. He paid a sheep to buy a prostitute. Paid using a sheep. So it's the reverse. So it says in the Mishnaic age text, mutarin, those sheep can be used on the altar. They're sheep used for crazy immorality, but they can still be brought in the altar. Because the verse doesn't describe that situation. Because Shenemar, because the verse reads, Gam Shnehem. When the verse says, you shall not offer a sheep used to pay for prostitution, or use a sheep, or offer a sheep that was used to pay for a dog, not to buy a prostitute, but pay for prostitution. The verse says, do not offer on the altar a sheep that was used to pay for prostitution, and do not use a sheep that was used to buy a dog. Right? That's the original case. You bought an actual dog. Not you. A person bought an actual dog, or a person paid for prostitution. right? And then the verse concludes, Gam shnehem, these two shall not be offered on the altar. These two as in the number two. So our sages derive, shnayim, these two, v'loy arba, not four cases. Because the Torah puts a number, this is a rule, and by the way, this is a rule, and we mentioned this once that we want to, when we come to rules and interpreting Torah, we should point them out. So this is another rule. The Torah assumes you can count. So the Torah gives a list. There's no reason for it to give you a number.
So if you can read, you can count.
That's right. So it doesn't have to give you the number and say, here are 5 items which are forbidden. Just count, you'll see it's 5. Why does the Torah have to articulate 5? So the Torah is articulating a number, it's because it wants to tell you something. These and no others. So it's only 5. In this case, it's 2. The Torah gave 2 cases and then says, these 2 shall not be offered on the altar. To teach you it's only these 2 and no other scenarios, not 4 cases. If the Torah didn't have the number of these 2, then you might conclude that the verse is giving you a principle. And that principle can apply to 4 cases, 10 cases, 20 cases, because the principle is being made here. But because the Torah says these 2 shall not be offered on the altar, what that means the verse is saying is that these 2 and no others, don't build a principle out of this, which is another rule of interpretation, which we mentioned in our list of 13 principles of interpretation. One of them is binyan av. Binyan av means to build a principle. Sometimes you can look at a verse, and based on the way the verse is structured, and based on the way the verse articulates the law, it's telling you to build a principle, not just telling you a specific law, but actually telling you to build a principle. This is like a reverse of that. Because the Torah gives a number, it's telling you don't build a principle. It's just these 2. So, therefore, the Torah says, these 2 cases, when a person uses a sheep to pay for prostitution, or uses a sheep to pay for the body of an actual dog, then these 2 cannot be offered on the altar. But if it was the reverse, where he paid for the purchase of a woman, and he paid for bestiality using a sheep, those can be offered on the altar. There's only 2 cases where the Torah told us not to bring to the altar. 2 and not 4.
That's coming to tell us that.
So what does that teach you?
Not a zona.
Oh, exactly. So this teaches you that the engaging in bestiality doesn't constitute as zina, doesn't constitute as, quote, zina, because the verse said, exactly, the verse said, don't pay for zina activity using a sheep. So, or sorry, reverse that, sorry. The Torah says, if you pay for zina activity with a sheep, that sheep can't be offered on the altar. If bestiality would be a zina, then you wouldn't be able to offer that sheep either. But because the Torah says 2 and not 4, meaning zina activity is only with a woman. You can't expand the verse. You can't expand the zina definition to include bestiality, because we just limited it to only this case constitutes as zina, even though it's completely horrible to do bestiality, but it doesn't constitute zina. So here's how we derive that zina doesn't constitute as bestiality. Bestiality doesn't constitute as zina, and therefore a husband who warns his wife against secluding herself with a animal, that warning is of no consequence, because he can only warn her against an activity that might make her a zina. And bestiality doesn't constitute zina, as terrible as it is. And if they came to me as a local rabbi, I'd certainly recommend therapy. That doesn't change the law, right? Okay, so this is where this really concludes this whole discussion in some ways, in that we've now we come to the conclusion as to what is the non-ish that the Mishnah is telling us. When the Mishnah says a warning about secluding herself with a non-ish is of no consequence, we have the conclusion it's talking about an animal. If he warns her about secluding with an animal, it's of no consequence, because an animal is not an ish, and because activity, bestiality, does not constitute zina. This is what we have. This is the conclusion. Now the Gemara takes us back to something we mentioned earlier. We mentioned in our discussion the first option as to what the non-ish was, which we rejected. But the first option was this person that we called a shachuf. A shachuf, we explained, is someone who is sick, some sort of illness or condition that doesn't allow him to engage in complete full sexual activity. Right? So, and that was the first option. Maybe this is someone who a warning with that guy doesn't have any consequence, because there's no sexual activity anyway. right? But then we concluded what Shmuel said, no. Shmuel told us a shachov, even someone who's incapable of complete sexual activity, does constitute an ish as an ish. And therefore, a husband who warns his wife against secluding herself with a shachov, that warning is of consequence. And if she violated the warning and secluded herself with that shachov, she'd become a Sotah. Now the Gemara is going to ask, well, why? If there's no sexual activity, then what's the point of this whole warning and the whole Sotah proceeding? The whole point of the Sotah proceeding is to determine whether she engaged intimately with that guy behind closed doors, right? She secluded herself. We know she secluded herself. We don't know what happened behind closed doors. So she's going to drink the water, and that water will determine whether she engaged that way or not. But if there's no possibility for such engagement, then what's the point? More specifically, let's see the Gemara. The verse says that he warns her about laying with someone. Shif Chazera means laying of seeding, which means the kind of sexuality here is the kind that produces seed. Now, this shachov, whatever sexual activity he's capable of, he certainly can't get to the point where he's producing seed. That's what makes him a shachov. So, lamali, why would I need those words in the verse? If the verse explicitly states, it doesn't just say that they lay together. It says they lay together, shichva zera, the kind of laying that produces seed. So to what point is it of those words if someone who can't produce seed still counts? Seemingly the verse is saying that the only suspicion is when there's a question of someone who can lay with her to the point of producing seed, and he can't. So what is the meaning of these words in the verse?
That's part of his warning with those actual words.
Sorry? It's part of the description of the verse.
Which is
the man lays with her a laying of seed. He can't produce seed. So what's the point of that verse if it doesn't come to exclude that guy, the shachov? Yeah. So explains the Gemara, those words that he lay with her, the laying of seed, or shiv chazera, comes to teach us another law. It's not coming to exclude the shachov. The shachov does count as sexual activity. He does constitute being an ish, and therefore a warning about him, would be full-on Sotah experience. We've established actually that he's an ish. But the question is, what is the point? What does the verse mean when it says laying of seed? What's that teaching us? If it's not coming to exclude the shachov. So thanks to the Gemara, look at the Tanya, it's coming to teach us the following teaching that we have in the Mishnaic H text, which reads, Shichva Zera, the verse we just quoted says, he lay with her the laying of seed. This term laying of seed, it's such an awkward translation. I'm trying to keep it literal so we can get the sense of what the verse is trying to do. Prat ledover acher. It comes to exclude, quote, another thing. Meaning, some other thing, which, no, not animal, but some other activity. Because we're talking about the man here, right? We're talking about a human that lay with her the laying of seed. And it's coming to exclude some other activity they might be doing. That doesn't constitute as, quote, the laying of seed. So, my davar acher, what is this other item? So, Rav Sheshes says, Prat l'shekinala, this excludes a situation in which he warned her, shaloi kedarka. He said, I please don't seclude yourself to engage with that guy in literally translated, it's intercourse not in its proper way. Meaning to say it's anal, to be straightforward. Not in its way, meaning it constitutes sexual activity, but it's not the proper sexual activity. And therefore it doesn't constitute as, quote, the laying of seed. Because the laying of seeding is the kind of laying that would produce children. That's what seeding means. Seeding doesn't just mean that he produces seed, but seeding means that there's like offspring that can happen here, even if it doesn't. But it's the kind of sexuality that would produce, it's not a sexual activity that would produce offspring. So if he warns her against sexual activity, but the kind of sexual activity that cannot produce offspring, right, then that warning doesn't constitute as a proper warning, because it doesn't fit the rubric of shichva zera, the laying of offspring, the laying of producing seed.
This would be included.
Would be excluded.
This would be excluded.
That's right. So if he warned her against secluding herself with another man for anal activity, right? And that warning is of no consequence because it doesn't qualify as shichva zera, the kind of laying that produces seed, that produces offspring. Clear? But the shachuf, even though the shachuf himself cannot produce children, but the laying he is doing, the sexual activity, is the kind that could produce children because he's engaging with her in a normal, intimate way, in normal sexuality. Clear? The Gemara rejects this. With me, we're going back and forth here, but I hope we're with me here. Yeah. So far clear? Okay, if something's not clear, please interrupt me because everything's going to build in the next. Okay, Amalei Rava responds to Rav Sheshes. Rav Sheshes is the one that suggested that if he warns her against secluding herself with someone to engage in, quote, abnormal sexual activity, anal sexual activity, then that warning is of no consequence because that doesn't constitute as laying of seeding. That was Rav Shesh's view. Amalei Rava tells, sorry? Rava is rejecting that and says, Shaloi Kadarka, sexual activity that is anal, Mishkevei Ishaksiv. It does constitute by Torah law as laying with a woman. And the verse says that he lay with her the laying of a woman. So I'm sorry. When the Torah describes the prohibition of homosexuality, it says, I'm reading here from the side here, the zachar and a male, loy sishkav, should not lay, mishkevei isha, the laying of a male, the laying of a woman. He shouldn't lay with a man in the laying of a woman.
That verse,
and with two men, it's only anal.
Yeah.
Right. So that indicates that anal sexuality does constitute as laying with a woman. So therefore, Rava says your suggestion that when the verse says that he warns her about laying with someone, the laying of seeding, and you're saying that excludes in abnormal sexual activity. Rav Shesha says no. The Torah elsewhere defines anal sexual activity as womanly laying as normal sexual activity.
It's Rava.
Rava says this. Yeah. So therefore, he has to give another definition for sexual activity that does not constitute the laying of seed. Following?
Do they use the same verse in both in the homosexuality prohibition as they do with the Sotah?
No, different verse. But same language, yes. Same language, not the same verse. No. But
so
right. So
it's
not quite the same. That's a good point. It's not quite the same. But nonetheless, Rashi tells us that by the verse, this is how Rashi tells us, by the verse saying that anal sexuality, meaning homosexuality, is the same thing as laying with women, the Torah is telling you treat these two sexual activities as exactly the same. So if this is forbidden, that's forbidden. If this constitutes as normative sexual behavior, so does this. Treat them the same, legally speaking. So it would constitute as laying of seed, even though it's not technically laying of seed, because the Torah connected the two. Yeah. Again, my screen went a little unclear. Let's see if I can clear it up. There we are. Okay. So Rava now has to tell us a different sexual activity that doesn't constitute laying of seed.
Or does it Rav Shesha have to?
Well, Rav Shesha stays by his opinion. Rava rejected it, so he comes. No, sometimes they do, but sometimes
Rava will produce some other.
We'll produce some alternative, yeah. So Elam Rava. So Rava comes and says, "Prat l'shekina la derech evara." This is if he warned her against secluding herself with engaging in sexual activity that is, quote, derech evara, using other limbs. Right? There are other ways in which a woman can satisfy man sexually that isn't ordinary intercourse and isn't anal. So there are other parts of her body that she can use. And that's what's being taught here. The only kind of activity that a husband can warn his wife about in order to constitute Sotah is only the kind of activity that's strictly to the sexual organs of the woman, which is ordinary intercourse and anal. Any other parts of the body doesn't constitute as the kind of activity that would make her a Sotah. This is Rava's opinion. Okay, and he stands by his. But then we have another opinion. Abaye tells Rava, you've gone too far. If it doesn't include her genitalia, then pritzutza ba'almahi, it doesn't constitute as sexual activity at all. It's just, pritzutz means it's simply inappropriate behavior. Doesn't constitute legally as sexuality at all. Notwithstanding the fact that the guy got his satisfaction, but as far as her end is concerned, it doesn't constitute as her engaging in sexuality because she didn't use those organs. It constitutes as inappropriate behavior, but not sexuality. And the whole point of the Sotah proceeding is he warns her against behaving in an inappropriate sexual manner, using her organs of sexuality, but not if she's behaving inappropriately. Inappropriate behavior doesn't constitute a Sotah. And it's the point. Does her behaving inappropriately render her have to divorce her husband? It doesn't. Only sexual activity on her part turns her into a zona that now has to divorce her husband. It's certainly terrible. Again, remember, this is not a moral pass on these activities. It's certainly immoral, and they probably should go to therapy and they have to deal with all their issues. It's a question of the legal rubric of what constitutes a zona and the legal rubric of what constitutes a Sotah. So if legally speaking, this is not the kind of sexuality that would render her forbidden to her husband, as horrible as it is, it cannot make her a Sotah. Because it's not sexual activity, it's pritzutza, it's just frivolity, it's just inappropriate. Sexuality, in terms of sexual activity, the Torah limits to the genitalia.
That's Rabbi's opinion.
This is Abaye rejecting Rabbi's opinion. Rabbi was saying that
any other parts of the body
constitute as a violation of the Sotah law, and therefore she would constitute a Sotah if he warned her about doing that kind of activity. But Abaye says it's frivolity, it's inappropriate, but it's not zona, it's not Sotah. Because zona and Sotah is limited to genitalia. Narrows it even further. So now he's stuck. He can't go to Rav Shesh's view and say the non-sexual sexual activity is anal. He can't say that because the Torah compared that to regular intercourse. He can't go as far as Rabbi to say that just any other limb constitutes as zona and Sotah, because he just made the point that that's just frivolity. It doesn't constitute a violation of the Sotah proceeding. So we have to find some middle ground. So prat l'nishikina la b'nishika. Abaye says it refers to a case where he warns her against genital contact without actual penetration. So it does constitute as bona fide sexual activity because it includes the genitalia, but it's not shechva zera. It's not a laying of seeding because there's no penetration. And that's the kind of warning that would be that's what the Torah is telling us. When the Torah says that he has to warn her against the laying of seed, it's coming to exclude genital contact. It doesn't include anything past that. Following?
When there's a penetration of some sort.
That's right.
Does it qualify?
That's right. And that's what the Torah is going to tell us. When it says laying of seed, it's telling us that the warning is only when he's warning her about actual penetration. But if he warns her about contact, that's not part of shechva zara, even though that would be sexual activity, because it's in that region. It's with those organs. Okay, I'm going to stop over here. But the Gemara is going to get even more detailed. If you thought this was graphic, it's going to get even more graphic in explaining, like,
You have to have a disclaimer.
I said this yesterday, nothing in Torah is off the table. If it exists in the world, Torah has to address it. All the famous lines of our sages are, "Yarda chachamim l'soif daitim shel adam." The sages have gone down to the depth of man's thinking. Meaning, Torah as a moral guide for life includes every part of life, even the most obscene of them.
Every part of the body.
Every part of the body and every part of life. Judaism, as we hear this 1,000 times, is not about escaping the physical reality. It's about sanctifying the physical reality. And if we're going to sanctify the physical reality, we have to get down to the details of the physical reality. What does constitute, what doesn't constitute. And give each, even in secular law, the law can't be vague. You have to be very specific as to what does constitute a violation of the law, what doesn't constitute a violation of the law, even if it means we're going to go down to places where we hope people never go. But we have to go down there to get down to exactly what exactly the law is.
But
Yeah.
going back to the original, the husband tells the wife, he warns his wife not to seclude himself with another man.
Okay, so that's a
Does he
good.
have to now tell his wife every single detail?
That's a good question. So the answer is
What not
the answer is
to do behind closed doors? Because if he forgets and he leaves something out,
very good question.
then she can do that because he didn't say it, specify it.
Okay, two
Or
things.
she understood.
Very, very good question. Excellent question. So two things. I was actually hoping you'd ask a question. But two things. Number one, the fact that warning doesn't constitute as a sort, the law does not make it permissible for her. It just means she doesn't have the sort of proceeding. It doesn't mean it's permissible. All these activities are completely wrong and not permissible, but doesn't qualify as sotah. That's number one. Number two is he does not have to make specific descriptions of what he's warning her about. If he warned her and says, don't seclude yourself with so-and-so, that's it, it's enough. The question is, if he went ahead and said, I'm warning you against secluding yourself with that guy, because don't you dare do that thing, whatever that thing is. Now the question is, did he ruin his warning by adding those words? Well, the question is that activity constitute the kind of sexuality that Torah is telling us that the proceeding is for? And that becomes the question. If he left it open-ended, don't seclude yourself, kid, that would be bona fide sotah, good to go. But because he added the words and defined exactly what he's warning her about, now the question is that activity in violation of what sotah is? And that's what the Gemara is discussing now. Does that activity constitute technical or legal sexual activity as to qualify as sotah? And you're stuck in a bind, because if it is actual sexual activity, then why shouldn't it be constituted as sotah? And if it's not sexual activity, then the whole warning is useless, because the whole warning is against sexual activity. So you have to find some sexual activity, but it isn't sexual to the point that it constitutes being sotah. That's the bind they're in. So first we suggested, that, okay, sexual activity is only if it's, ordinary intercourse. Right, but if it's anal, it doesn't count as a sexual activity.
Try explaining that
To which Rabbi said, no, that is, by Torah law, that is sexual activity. Okay, so we're going to say it's other limbs. But other limbs is so far away from her sexual organs that it's not sexual activity at all, that it won't constitute a sotah at all. So Abai brings us back to the middle and says it's a warning against her sexual organs, and therefore you might have thought it could be included in the sotah law, but it's excluded because the Torah says no, it has to be the laying of seed. Clear?
The parties have the ability to change the rules of the sotah.
We're going to get to that.
That's what we're going to discuss.
We're going to get to that. We're going to get to that. Like maybe, right? That's correct. We're going to get down to it. To what degree is the Torah saying you have to follow our rubric, or is Torah saying, well, what do you guys care about? Yeah, what do you guys care about as a couple? What bothers you?
That's
And maybe that's what defines Sotah law. Or no, you got to follow the strict legal ruling of what Sotah is. Right? So that's what we're going to get to that tomorrow. Yes, it's exactly the direction we're going. So very good.
Thank you, Rabbi Yeshikoah. All the very best to you all. Have a blessed day.
Especially important to remember today, this is Hashem's will and wisdom. And that's why we do this, go through this exercise. Hashem's will and wisdom goes down to the depth of the most profane human experiences. In this way, we elevate those experiences. All these activities we're describing are elevated because now they aren't just items that exist in the world for people to have a good time, but they're items of our learning. They're items of our understanding Hashem's Torah. So we've elevated these items just by learning about them. That's what they're truly created for. They're not created for actual activity. They exist as an idea, so we can learn about it. That's why they exist. And that's their elevation. Okay, have a wonderful day, Yidden.
All the best. Thank you.
Without putting an idea to,
All the best. Thank you.
without putting an idea to,
Implementation.
yeah, then it's just an idea.
That's right, but ideas also exist in our world. Even if no one ever does them, they still exist.
Right.
Right?
But it's just an idea.
That's right. So certain activities which exist in this world,
Like if I
We
have
hope-
an idea, if I have an idea that I'm gonna make a certain product, right? I
Right.
never make the product. But I have an idea to make a product. But I never make it.
right, but then,
It's just an idea.
okay,
That's all it is. Just an idea.
there's a point like this. So what Torah tells us not to engage in bestiality.
Right,
What that means is bestiality is a notion that exists within human nature.
right, but it's
Because
also
Torah
a
does
thing
not,
that actually.
because Torah does
exists.
not say, Torah does not give us a prohibition, do not jump onto the sun.
No, but
Because doesn't,
reality
because,
is a thing that it actually exists. People do that.
but even if no one ever did it, and we hope no one ever does, it's still a notion that exists within human nature,
Right. but
which should be
it's-
contained, right? So the elevation of that notion happens A, by no one engaging it, but that's not an elevation. That's just, we're staying away from it because because we don't want to get dragged down. The elevation of that notion is by us learning about it in Torah.
but
Follow what I'm
the
saying?
sage- Yeah, but the sages are speaking about it at the time when they're writing the Gemara.
Yeah,
They're speaking about it because it's more than just an idea. It's a thing that actually exists.
not necessarily, not necessarily. Because the Gemara will go on for pages discussing things and conclude that this will never happen. At least according to some opinions. Say that you're in Dachas, the Ben Ser Gemara, there's certain laws that the Gemara says this will never happen. It's too complex to ever happen. But as a notion, it exists, a theoretical concept. Right? And that too is God's Torah, will, and wisdom, must be learned and understood. Follow?
I'm following, but in this particular case, it's an.
I'm sure it does exist.
It does exist.
And unfortunately, it exists probably today too.
Yeah.
I thank God no one like-
Thing that exists. That's what
I
I'm
thank
saying.
God no one like that, but
More-
it's just.
It's more than just an idea.
But I'm saying is that we hope that it remain. We hope that no one ever does it, right?
No,
And yet we'll still learn about it because the concept exists, and our learning of it elevates it because it's part of Torah now.
no, I understand, but I'm saying it's more, it's not
Yeah.
just an idea. It's a
Unfortunately, it's
real- Unfortunately, it's a real thing.
Unfortunately, it's not just an idea.
It's
Yeah,
just not, it's more than just an idea.
Yep.
And like I said, if the sages were speaking about it then, because I think it was,
that's what I'm saying. That's not. It probably was an idea, but the fact that they talked about it doesn't make it a reality. They could have talked about things that are theoretical completely. They do, and admitting so. They'll go on for pages discussing a law and say this is all theoretical. But it doesn't matter. It's still God's wisdom and will, so they'll
Yeah.
discuss it. Okay. We're not arguing, just making that point.
yeah, I understand.
Okay, have a wonderful day, Eden.